Dr. Igor Galtsua, please go ahead.
For having me here. Is it possible to turn off the simultaneous translation so I don't hear myself in French? Thank you. Mr. Madame Senators, thank you for accepting to hear what the psychiatrists from Quebec have had to say. We have been very concerned about the bill since its inception, and in fact, this whole thing started when we did a sondage, a survey of our members in order to find out, and it was overwhelming that the psychiatrists in this province were very, very concerned about the impacts on mental health of the legalization of cannabis. Because I have only 5 minutes to speak with you, I will sort of bring up a bunch of things in bullet points, and if you want to ask me questions about specifics, I'll be happy to answer them afterwards. So because cannabis consumption is prevalent in youth, because the project of legalization is already contributing to the myth that cannabis use is safe, because the concentration of THC in the illegal markets has grown from approximately 4% in 1995 to 12% in 2012, and because in other jurisdictions where cannabis was legalized, the concentration of THC grown in legalized cannabis has increased even more rapidly than in illegal markets to levels up to 30%. Because when Colorado and the Netherlands saw an increase in this THC potency of the cannabis strains being sold on their territory, the governments attempted to modify their legislation to limit the maximum concentration of THC, and they failed to do this due to the growing cannabis lobby. Because cannabis consumption predisposes vulnerable youth to developing psychotic illnesses, and because the earlier the youth begin consuming and the more potent the THC and the more frequent the use, the higher the risks of psychosis, and because the continued use worsens the prognosis of psychotic illness, and because 50%
understand me, Dr. Igartua, because we've lost you.
Oh.
Could you continue to speak normally? Anything you might see that we could check the volume or sound? Could you again speak?
I'm sorry about this.
No, that's fine. Okay.
Problem.
No, that's fine.
Could I move the microphone at all?
No, that's fine. Don't touch anything so far. It seems to work. I will just ask you to go back to the last sentence that you were having, because that one we lost.
Okay, so I was saying that 50% of those who develop a toxic psychosis, so a psychosis secondary to cannabis, will develop a schizophreniform illness in the subsequent 10 years. Because the earlier use of cannabis is related to a greater risk of dependence and a reduced scholastic achievement, the Association of Quebec Psychiatrists is very, very concerned about the legalization of cannabis in Canada and hopes that a certain number of safeguards be put in place in the context of this bill. Firstly, every effort should be deployed to reduce cannabis consumption in teenagers and young adults. We know that the brain continues to mature to age 25 and that the endocannabinoid system, which helps the brain mature, is very, very active in adolescence and young adulthood and is very sensitive to THC and to cannabis and to other cannabinoids. So the AMPQ had recommended that the minimum age for legal purchasing of cannabis be set at 21 and not at 18. Though science would have us even suggest age 25, 21 is a compromise between the age of majority in this country and the that's arbitrarily set at 18, and the age of brain maturity, which is more around the age of 25. If, for reasons other than mental health, the government's decided to keep the minimum age at age 18, we would ask that the maximum THC concentration be determined at the outset and not to wait and make the errors that have been done in other jurisdictions. We propose to the Quebec government a maximum of 15 or 16% for those with mature brains, and that we half the concentration of THC for those under 21, so that we restrict it to a lighter form of THC, around 8%. We believe the method of distribution should remain public, should not be private, and should not be for profit, and that without any publicity, and that all the monies be reinvested in prevention and treatment of mental illnesses. The THC content should be clearly identified on packaging, and it should be neutral and without any branding. Educational materials should be developed in order, on the one hand, to teach teenagers about the effects of cannabis, what the potential risks are, and how to reduce the risks when consuming. We know that there's about 30% of teenagers that consume. We need to teach them how to mitigate the risks of their consumption. In fact, the AMPQ was so concerned about this that we've already put out some educational materials. You may have seen them on our web. We have a poster that is for distribution in the schools that teaches about the effects of cannabis on the brain and the potential risks. And we've also put together a PowerPoint presentation for many of our psychiatrists who are volunteering in high schools to teach about this, because, as I said, we are quite concerned. The drug education curriculum ideally would go beyond just teaching about the risks of cannabis, but also include a section on what are the motivations for using and what are alternative strategies for treating things like anxiety and sadness and boredom that happens in teenagers, and strategies for resisting peer pressure. So a little bit more of an emotional education piece to it. And finally, given that accidental cannabis poisoning incidents of youngsters, and now I'm not even talking about teenagers, I'm talking about young children, increases with homegrown cannabis, given that the plants are not plants that can be hidden away like liquor in a liquor cabinet, but rather that need a lot of sunlight to grow, it is conceivable that people who grow cannabis at home will have these plants out and in the reach of youngsters. So we think it would be more prudent if the government, at least in this first bill, were to prohibit home growing of cannabis. This would also do something to ensure the quality and safety and make sure there's not much contaminants. I'd be happy to tell you more about brain development, about psychosis, about dependence, and about school failures during the question period. I'm just very mindful of not taking too much of your time. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guartois, and there definitely will be an opportunity for honorable senators to ask you questions to complete your presentation. Thank you. I would like now to invite